It's not for the Ukrainians to decide on the border they can live with. It's really not. As long as they take our money, our weapons, and they get our support from NATO, we have a say. If they want to fight a war completely alone, they have a say. That's the fact. That's how that works. It's our blood and treasure. It's our decision as a people of what we're willing to tolerate and what we're going to do. And if Ukrainians don't like it, well, they can choose to fight without our support. That's called an alliance. We had to make this decision with the Gulf War. We invade, we take back Kuwait, we kick the Iraqis out. We had built a coalition. The Secretary of Defense of the United States of America wanted to continue pushing to Baghdad and have regime change. That was Dick Cheney back then with George H.W. Bush. And the Saudis and others who were in the alliance said, we will not support regime change. So we said, you know what? We'll just sanctions and mission accomplished. We'll go home. That is what an alliance means. You have gives and takes. And if you take someone's support, you have to accept the borders. You have to accept things. The Yalta Conference was another example. 1945, as we closed out the World War II, the Soviets spent an enormous amount of blood and treasure. And we had to make some decisions about how to chop up Europe. And the Soviets wanted to take the whole thing. And we made some decisions there. And unfortunately, FDR was a poor negotiator because he was dying. Literally died, I think, a week or two after the conference. Gave him Poland. Shouldn't have done it. They had to live under tyranny for decades as a direct result, despite the fact they fought really hard. Now tell me, how much of a say did Poland have on their sovereignty there? The great powers decided. And that's what happens to small countries when they get caught up in conflicts with great powers. And that's why we created the United Nations and these types of things, to try to give some sort of sovereignty back to little countries. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen. And in practice, things get challenging. And Ukraine has been a MacGuffin that's been in the geopolitical lexicon since the Soviet Union collapsed. And there's been lots of discussions on both sides about spheres of influence. The NATOification of Europe is another example of that. 2000, there was 20 NATO countries. Now there are 31, soon to be 32. And what does that translate to? Translates to the US and NATO getting closer and closer and closer to Russia. And Russia made a hard line saying, if you try to get Ukraine to join NATO, we will not allow US nuclear weapons to be 200 miles away from Moscow, just like we wouldn't allow nuclear weapons from Russia to be in Cuba. It is a hard line. And also, we need access to the Black Sea. We're not going to lose these ports. We're not going to lose this economic geopolitical influence. And we said, well, how about you join NATO? And then a war breaks out. We said, we just don't know where the war came from. We have no clue about it, even though they've been talking about this for 20 fucking plus years. Actually, since 1986, when Reagan and Gorbachev got together in Reykjavik, when they were discussing behind the scenes that they were going to withdraw from East Germany and reunify Germany, and kind of hammering out the breakup of the Soviet Union, because the writing was on the wall for this. And people wanted to manage the collapse without World War III happening, because a third of the planet was going to be under new management within 5 years. Think about how complicated that is. Foreign policy and geopolitics, very complicated. And what makes it so hard is that people don't get the truth. What they do is they get the surface level propaganda discussion of it that's laced and burdened with whoever benefits from it. War is tremendously profitable for some and horrific for many, which is why you shouldn't have them. And it's why you should always sue for peace where and when it's possible. And you have to be very clear about what you're willing to do. What's the mission in Ukraine? You tell me, Robert. Is it regime change? Are we going to go kill Putin? Then who do we replace him with? Is it restoring the borders before the war broke out? The 2014 borders, the 2007 borders, 1991, I think, when they came back. I mean, what territories are going to be seceded? Is Crimea is going to come back? What are we doing here? Will Russians have free entry into Ukraine like they used to? And will they be able to go on vacation again in Odessa? Or now they're persona non grata? Is there any protections that are going to come to the territories that are re-annexed with the Eastern Ukrainians who speak Russian and collaborated with the Russian government? Or will they be ethnically cleansed? Are they going to have to go back to Russia? So are they going to be kicked out of the homes that they grew up in Ukraine? Because now those radicalized people on the Western side who speak Ukrainian, and they feel the people in the East betrayed their country and are collaborators and should be executed and beaten to death. Kind of reminds you of Iraq, doesn't it? With the Victor's Justice and the Shia when they took over and they were really angry at all those Ba'ath Party Sunnis. It's really complicated now. Wow, there's a lot of moving pieces to this, isn't there? Oh no, and that's war. There's a lot of moving pieces. It's very challenging, and it really is hard when people work through it. And you have to look at the whole map. You have to have a vision, and you have to understand, what are we actually doing here? What is the mission? And if you can't answer it, here's what you're doing. You're buying time with the lives of young people. Every month this goes on, tens of thousands of people die. And if you get the same outcome we could have gotten in 2022 before Boris Johnson was sent to fuck it all up, then all those people who died, they died just like people in World War I for nothing. There was no regime change. There was no magical embrace of freedom. They died for nothing. The borders stayed exactly the same. And will the politicians be punished? No, they'll get their Nobel Peace Prize. They'll get their beautiful chalet in Geneva. They'll be able to write a tell-all book. The villains will stay villains. The heroes will stay heroes. And both sides get to say that they won. That's what you get. Unless you're prepared to go all the way. And that includes up to and including a nuclear war. And if you're prepared for that, okay, there we go. Let's do it. It's World War III. Huzzah. That's where the world's at.